Now, it is my great honor and pleasure to kick things off for AxeCon 2025. And I can think of no individual better suited to deliver our inaugural keynote than Alice Wong. Alice is a trailblazer in disability rights. She is the founder and director of the Disability Visibility Project. Alice challenges oppressive norms, actively creating space for people with disabilities to be heard, respected, and lead in every sphere of our society. Housekeeping note, this session will be recorded and hosted on demand for registrants. If you need live captions for this session, you can access those in the video player or use the transcript link on the session page. With that, please join me in welcoming Alice Wong to AxeCon. Alice, you describe yourself as an Asian American disabled oracle or cyborg. Can you tell me what that means?
Hi everyone, it's really exciting to speak with you all at AxeCon. I want to thank everyone at DQ who helped organize and sponsor this event and Glenda Sims for being in conversation with me. I also want to thank the captioner and ASL interpreters. I'm using a text-to-speech app to speak and there may be some pauses during the conversation. This app may also mispronounce words. So let's get started. First, I'll give a visual description of myself. I am an Asian American disabled woman who is sitting in a wheelchair. I am wearing a black shirt with metallic circles. And I am also wearing a bright red lip color. There is a tracheostomy at my neck that is connected to a ventilator. I think of myself as a disabled oracle and cyborg. Disabled people are canaries in a coal mine. We often know of things what will happen based on our wisdom, our lived experiences, but the world doesn't listen. One of the best examples is with the pandemic, and I want to emphasize the pandemic is still happening, it's not in the past. Disabled people know what it means to be interdependent and vulnerable. We know how the state will not protect us, that we have to save each other, that mutual aid is something that we and other marginalized people have always done, and how proposed bans on wearing masks in various cities isn't about safety. These laws will further push disabled people out of public spaces, which is a return of laws from the 1800s called the ugly laws that banned disabled people from being in public. We know that wearing a mask is an act of community care, that we are keeping high-risk people like me who can't mask safe. Born with a progressive neuromuscular disability, my body has evolved requiring more assistance externally and internally. I am connected to tubes such as a ventilator attached to my tracheostomy and a feeding tube that provided as nutrition and hydration. I am dependent on electricity to keep me alive, and I'm at risk whenever a power outage occurs, especially if it's longer than 24 hours. Unlike a theoretical cyborg described by Donna Haraway, a scholar in science and technology studies and feminist theory, disabled people have always been real, thinking, breathing, cyborgs that hacked and adapted to state-sanctioned neoliberal austerity in order to survive and thrive. I think of myself as a cyborg for those reasons. I have hardware inside my body and I am tethered to all kinds of machinery that keeps me functioning.
Thank you for sharing your lived experience about being a real thinking, breathing cyborg, hacking a too often hostile environment in order to survive and thrive. Before we talk about accessibility, you told me that you would like to talk about ableism first. Can you share more about what ableism is?
Most non-disabled people barely know what ableism is, and everyone can and should do some political education. Look at your bookshelf and count how many books are by disabled people. If you are on social media, are you following any disabled people? What do you know about disability history and culture? I want to take this moment to describe it by sharing a working definition of ableism by T.L. Lewis. T.L. wrote on their blog, quote, "Ableism is a system of assigning value to people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, productivity, desirability, intelligence, excellence, and fitness. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in eugenics, anti-blackness, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. This systemic oppression that leads to people and society determining people's value based on their culture, age, language, appearance, religion, birth or living place, health, wellness, and/or their ability to satisfactorily reproduce, excel, and behave. You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism." End quote. You can find this definition and more at TL's blog at talalewis.com/blog. Ableism is an attitude, and it's also systemic, finding its way into every aspect of our society. And it's important for us to identify and dismantle it. We need people in power to change policies and practices. I would like to see tech leaders speak up and fight for disabled people and actually listen and learn from them, even if it challenges their training and education. We also need more disabled people in all fields. And don't forget, budgets are a reflection of values. The issues are complex and often go beyond the tech industry, but everyone can use their voice and at least identify systemic problems.
Thank you. And what does ableism have to do with digital accessibility? Why should we care about ableism?
I have a feeling many of you are thinking about this and how this talk might be a waste of your time. Just imagine if we are discussing racism and why we should care about racism. The reasons are obvious, right? Ableism is a form of discrimination and systemic oppression that shapes everything in our society. It is intertwined of oppression. Like racism and sexism, ableism classifies entire groups of people as less than. It centers non-disabled bodies and ways of thinking as the norm, with everyone as less than. Inaccessibility is one manifestation of ableism. Ableism in technology is the discrimination and bias against people with disabilities that is built into technological systems. It can manifest in many ways, including the design of technology and the lack of accessibility features. So, I am inviting you all to think about ableism as this higher level that shapes the landscape that you are in. I'd like you to think about your role in this ecosystem and how you, your company, and the field of digital accessibility are de-ableist or not. The starting point is to learn more about ableism and disability justice, even if it doesn't apply to your day-to-day work. Any technology product or service is shaped by human bias, and that bias includes sexism, racism, ableism, and transphobia. In my mind, that is important for your company to acknowledge. And to answer the first question, what does ableism have to do with digital accessibility? I would specifically say confidently that our society does not value accessibility. Making this generalization, I would go on to say that our society does not value accessibility because it is framed as quote-unquote special treatment or legal obligation. or something that is for a small fraction of the population, while conveniently ignoring the fact that 1 in 4 people in the United States has some sort of disability. Because we do not center or value accessibility, it is an afterthought. It is not de facto or baked into every design and development decision. It is seen as something that disrupts the aesthetic of a building or beautiful app. It is in the province of remediation and often done only begrudgingly due to litigation or threat of litigation. This parallels our attitude toward disability and disabled people. If we truly paid more than lip service today, then we would center those most impacted and actually give them the power to address ways to rectify historic marginalization. For disabled people, this would mean hiring disabled people who not only have qualifications, but also lived experience, which is a skill set in itself. It would mean companies like the one you work for would empower. Side note, I don't like to use that word very often. Your employer would empower disabled employees to guide and inform the company on the creation of your products rather than just hiring people for user experience testing. If we lived in a society and world that truly values access, companies like the ones you work for would talk about digital accessibility as a fundamental human right that is not contested. I long to live in a world where disabled people don't have to keep begging for access when we are entitled to it. Disabled people have to expend so much labor just for the bare minimum. The same playing field/user experience when non-disabled people take their privilege for granted. On a related note, I'd like to share a concept with you that's coined by Dr. Ashley Shu called techno-ableism. It may or may not relate to your work, but it's a concept that speaks to a broader context of disability and technology. Dr. Shu wrote, quote, I came up with the term techno-ableism to describe the pattern disabled people see over and over, and a pattern observed by many others too. Techno-ableism is a particular type of ableism, one that is highly visible in media and entertainment and omnipresent in the ways most people casually talk about technologies aimed at disability. Technologies for disability can never just be tools that are useful sometimes, in the phrasing of Jen Lee Reeves. Techno-ableism is a belief in the power of technology that considers the elimination of disability a good thing, something we should strive for. It's a classic form of ableism, bias against disabled people, bias in favor of non-disabled ways of life. Techno-ableism is the use of technologies to reassert those biases, often under the guise of empowerment. Disabled people are often on the front lines of tech users. We are considered the first testing ground for new tech like exoskeletons, closed captioning, automatic door openers, text-to-voice and voice-to-text software, and more, tech that is then picked up by all. Yet we are usually left out of the conversations around tech for disability. There are ongoing calls for universal design, but this design employs and imagines our bodies while rarely simply asking us what we need. Sometimes technology is seen as redeeming our lives. Non-disabled people believe, and expect us to believe, that technology will solve the problem of our disability and save us, or those like us, in the future. Yet these expectations often don't match our circumstances. They confine us. When we don't listen to those with actual experience, we often get accounts of disability and technology completely wrong. Disabled people are the real experts when it comes to technology and disability. We use technologies. We also reject them, grapple with them, or repurpose them. The views on technology we get from listening to disabled people often look very different from those of people educated in the medical and helping professions. End quote. For more, You can read this book by Dr. Ashley Shue titled Against Techno-Ableism, Rethinking Who Needs Improvement. Being part of the digital accessibility field puts you in a place where your work impacts a lot of disabled people. I don't know if fixing, I'm using air quotes with that word, eliminates ableism altogether because there are so many systemic and social aspects to ableism. Inaccessibility is but one small facet of ableism that I'd like to emphasize with you all. I think knowing more about ableism and taking intentional steps in your company, being committed to undoing your implicit ableist bias, and jointly being intentionally anti-ableist as part of your commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion are positive steps forward. And by the way, I urge this company to continue your policies and practices regarding DEI as the political landscape has corporations kowtowing to the current administration that is blatantly rolling back gains this country made in civil liberties and social justice. Not only am I urging you to remain committed to DEI, I am also encouraging this company to include an A to DEI to represent accessibility. In fact, there are universities and other institutions that actually have DEI policies. What a marvel that accessibility is seamlessly integrated in a company's efforts to create an inclusive and welcoming workplace.
Alice, your wisdom about the relationship between ableism and digital accessibility really reframes how we need to think about this. You are such a dynamic force in the disability space. You reimagine and showcase disabilities with insights like accessibility is an act of love instead of a burden or an afterthought, and how your memoirs showcase disabled joy. Can you talk about the importance of this perspective? How can others embrace this and put it into practice?
The phrase accessibility is an act of love reflects a shift from the rights-based framework from a disability justice framework. The phrase is from a speech by Mia Mingus and looks at access as a collective responsibility instead of a sole responsibility placed on a few individuals. In the 2018 speech, Mia said, quote, "I don't just want technical and logistical access. I don't just want inclusion, I want liberatory access and access intimacy. I want us to not only be able to be part of spaces, but for us to be able to fully engage in spaces. I don't just want us to get a seat at someone else's table, I want us to be able to build something more magnificent than a table, together with our accomplices. I want us to be able to be understood and to be able to take part in principled struggle together, to be able to be human together. Not just placated or politely listened to," end quote. I believe that everyone can contribute to access in both big and small ways. You don't have to have a degree or technical knowledge to be an expert. For example, how many of you include alt text to your images that you post on social media if you're on it? How many of you listen to a podcast that doesn't provide a text transcript? With the current wildfires happening in Los Angeles, I was dismayed by important information about weather and evacuations posted without accessibility, and we as consumers of this media can and should call them out and push them to do better. It seems like a burden, right? How does someone provide good alt text? It takes time and people don't want to spend it on that. Well, once you adopt a new practice, it slowly gets easier. And this is a great way to practice what you preach. It can take time and lots of practice, but pretty soon before you know it, adding alt text to your images on X or Instagram or Blue Sky will become second nature. So I am challenging all of you who work in disability accessibility to start adding alt text to your social media and making that part of your everyday practice. So many disabled people I know have an expertise based on their experiences living in a non-disabled world where they have to hack and cobble structures and other things that go beyond the built environment, such as ableist ideologies, in order to survive and thrive. For example, if you see something that is unjust, you can speak out about it in partnership with the impacted person, instead of swooping in like a savior, sharing your energy and time and pushing back against something wrong, such as a broken elevator in your apartment building that takes forever to be repaired, or policies at your workplace that you know to be unfair to your disabled colleagues, is a form of solidarity and allyship. Everyone can create access and push for change. It's not filing a complaint and leaving it to another entity to take care of it. Everyone can question and reflect on how their daily activities and practices promote access or not. As I mentioned in the beginning, expanding about the way we think of accessibility from a rights-based approach to a justice-based approach is one place to start. Disability justice emerged because the disability rights movement does not inherently centralize the needs and experiences of folks experiencing intersectional oppression. For a majority of the history of the disability rights movement, for any of you who might have studied it, it has been white, middle class, and centered on people with physical disabilities. The ideas of what issues are priorities and the emphasis of legislation as the driver for social change are centered by those people. If anyone has seen the Netflix documentary Crip Camp, this is one example of how disability rights movements before the establishment of the ADA were not the most inclusive or diverse. I am not saying that rights are not valuable or that these two frameworks are diametrically opposed. And of course, what I am describing is a broad generalization, and that multiple movements have occurred throughout history by different groups of disabled people. Patty Byrne is one of the key architects of disability justice. She outlined 10 principles of disability justice several years ago in a blog post for the organization Sense Invalid. While I said I'm not here to teach a seminar, here's a brief overview. Principle 1. Intersectionality, ableism, coupled with white supremacy, supported by capitalism, underscored by heteropatriarchy, has rendered the vast majority of the world invalid. Principle 2. Leadership of those most impacted, people whose lives are most enmeshed in systems, are the experts. Principle 3. Anti-capitalist politic. In an economy that sees land and humans as components of profit, we are anti-capitalist by the nature of having non-conforming body minds. Principle 4. Commitment to cross-movement organizing. Social justice movements need to understand disability and contextualize ableism. Disability justice lends itself to politics of alliance. Principle 5. Recognizing wholeness, people have inherent worth outside of capitalist notions of productivity. Each person is full of history and life experience. Principle 6. Sustainability. We pace ourselves, individually and collectively, to be sustained long-term. Our embodied experiences guide us toward ongoing justice and liberation. Principle 7. Commitment to cross-disability solidarity. We honor the insights and participation of all of our community members, knowing that isolation undermines collective liberation. Principle 8. Interdependence. We meet each other's needs as we build toward liberation, knowing that state solutions inevitably extend into further control over lives. Principle 9. Collective access. We bring flexibility and creative nuance that go beyond able-bodied minded normativity, to be in community with each other. Principle 10. Collective liberation. No body or mind can be left behind. Only mobbing together can we accomplish the revolution we require. End quote. To learn more about disability justice, I recommend the book Care Work, Dreaming Disability Justice by Leelakshmi Sinha, and a disability justice primer from Sins Invalid titled Skin, Tooth, and Bone. The basis of movement is our people. For me, disability justice is about collectivity and values that guide me on the kind of human I want to be. Some of you might find this completely unrelated to your field, but I would suggest that you think of disabled people as more than your users or customers. By working in the field of digital access, I think you should push yourself and dig deeper into disability culture and history. I hope you don't have this less than perspective, because there are disabled people in your field and you can become part of the disability community by sharing your knowledge and becoming open to input and critique by disabled people.
Alice, I love how you connected the big picture disability justice principles to everyday actions like adding alt text to social media. Your challenge for us to shift from a rights-based to a more justice-based framework so that we can see digital accessibility as way more than just technical compliance really resonates. And building on these ideas, what does digital accessibility mean to you?
Earlier I talked about the phrase access is love, and when I navigate online platforms that are effortless and elegant means that these creators give a shit about disabled people. It's as simple as that. For example, if I had a visual disability and am stuck on a page because of a CAPTCHA test and there is no alternative to bypass it, it sends a message that I do not matter and that the labor and time I spend on getting through that test does not matter. Like the organic physical world that we inhabit in our meat suits, accessibility is everything. It's like breathing, it's important and informs every thought and activity we have. Just as developers have a responsibility to follow best practices and go beyond WCAG standards, because let's face it, standards are the ground floor and there's always room for advancement. Individuals have a responsibility to be accessible when they are in digital spaces, whether they are a developer or just a person who uses TikTok. I do my best to make my social media as accessible as possible, create accessible PDFs, use website templates that are accessible, and transcribe audio for my podcast, which ended several years ago. I am constantly learning and making mistakes, and the practice of making things accessible slowly becomes like second nature, and I hope for some of you in the audience that it becomes second nature too. Whether I benefit from a particular accessibility feature or not, I value it because it welcomes as many people into this digital space, which really is my home. Being extremely online, I've seen horrible websites and apps. When Twitter was acquired by Musk and he disbanded their entire accessibility section, I knew this place where I found community and became an organizer was doomed. And yet I am still there because my people are still there. For a lot of marginalized people, online spaces have been lifelines and places where we thrive. Despite the inaccessibility and lack of safety, online spaces still have value. And if these spaces were more accessible, more of us would be able to find each other and build power together.
Thank you for these crucial insights, emphasizing that accessibility is as fundamental as breathing and can truly help create safe spaces for communities online. And building on that, what is the most effective way you've found to get accessibility on the agenda of an organization or a movement that doesn't prioritize it?
This is a great question because it's one of the most difficult things to do when you feel like you are all alone and that the leadership does not care about access despite paying lip service to diversity, inclusion, and equity, which often leaves out accessibility. If we're talking about the tech space specifically, there's still quite a few people who do not identify as disabled and do not feel comfortable disclosing it for many professional and personal reasons. And when you are spearheading something by yourself or with a small group, that can feel insurmountable because corporations and institutions are slow to change and there's often little incentive for them to change. My approach is to be strategic and realistic. I would first figure out what is the actual change you want to make and if it's going to be systemic or a one-off effort. So many of us have individual access needs, but if we get them met, it ends there. It doesn't help other people who may or will be in that same situation, and the cycle repeats itself. When I was in college and grad school, I had to advocate for myself, but the expenditure of labor made me realize larger, more complex goals would be a better use of my time if it could actually impact the organization as a whole. So let's say there's an issue at a workplace about accessible transit on campus. Employees may be the first ones to experience it and want to do something about it. They need to identify who to reach out to, whether it's the head of the Department of Transportation or some sort of committee or working group on access. Do some research, talk to people, find out if there are opportunities to build coalitions with others within the organization. Even if it's a small group, you can build power together. And being realistic is important too, because as you talk and start learning more about what it will take to improve accessibility, you'll realize the steps involved, who needs to be part of the decision-making process, and what kind of pressure and education is required. This is often a long game, and it may become a challenge to keep this effort sustainable over time. And mind you, this is all unpaid labor and advocacy. People naturally burn out or have to deal with other things, so this is all to be expected. Learning more about the issue and who can partner with you, having a plan and engaging with administration or leadership, and understanding that change isn't going to happen overnight, but it can be helpful in prioritizing accessibility. Making the case for your issue and getting buy-in from leadership is just another part of the process that requires a lot of time and patience. This is a really long answer to say that when you form relationships, get people to understand the problem, and identify people who will champion this goal, it can possibly be successful. But I need to also say that what matters to you may not matter to others, and that's probably the most difficult part, getting people in power to value accessibility and incentivize them to prioritize it. Even though it's the right thing to do, many organizations will not change unless they are forced or prompted to, and that's being realistic, since the politics within any organization will undoubtedly play a role in its likelihood of success.
So true. So very, very true. Your strategic approach to creating lasting change speaks to the power of collective action. And this connects beautifully to your work as the founder and director of the Disability Visibility Project. What are important considerations when building communities around disability and digital accessibility? Why is community so important and impactful for advocacy work?
I founded the Disability Visibility Project in 2014, and initially it was an oral history campaign to encourage disabled people to record their stories. And then it grew to include guest essays, a podcast, online communities, and Twitter chats back in the day when people organized chats and it was actually fun, and several books such as my latest anthology titled Disability Intimacy, Essays on Love, Care, and Desire. You can find out more about everything I just mentioned on my website at disabilityvisibilityproject.com. There's no single formula when building an online community. It's often done collectively, not individually. For disabled people in particular, one thing that is gratifying to witness is the way we create collective access and that we recognize conflicting access needs. It might be an online conference or a Twitter chat, and collective access happens when building in access is crowdsourced. Some people can design an accessible website, while others transcribe audio into text. People do with what they have that's within their means, which is a mindful kind of building with disabled people who have varying levels of energy and capacity. And the important thing is to not pressure everyone to contribute, to not perpetuate our capitalist obsession with productivity, which is actually ableist. I'm going to digress for a minute. Our society is centered on individualism that equates productivity with value, and in turn, those who do not produce to normative standards are pushed to the edges and considered parasites. Just think about the political rhetoric around safety net programs and the coverage of people who depend on them to live, as just one example. This often leaves disabled people behind who want to be in the workforce, but are driven out due to a lack of flexibility and inclusive culture despite the laws that exist. You can have a law that protects your rights, but it's just a law that isn't always enforced and is interpreted in many different ways. So it's really beautiful to see when you are engaged in a project where people from all over the world work together on something and no one is shamed for doing a little or nothing at all. Accessibility, digital or any other kind, is not a finite, knowable, objective thing. Access means different things to different people, and there is no such thing as total access. Anytime you see a product marketed as 100% accessible is bullshit. Or it's based on a specific metric or checklist. But accessibility is more than a checklist, toolkit, or set of guidelines. It's really an ethos, a way of life and attitude. When you have a group of diverse people coming together in online spaces or in person, it's impossible for everyone to have the same user experience that one would characterize as accessible. What helps one group of users may be inaccessible for another, and when these conflicts arrive, compromises have to be made, which pleases no one. But I don't see this as a failure. I see it as an acknowledgement of the heterogeneity of our amazing community and an acknowledgement that perfection is a myth. The process, the journey people take together to problem solve and make decisions, is worthwhile and a source of wisdom. There is so much wisdom by disabled people who hack digital and in-person spaces to tailor them to their needs. Community, regardless of where it resides, is power. And when you are part of a group and identify with it, you can move mountains. Earlier I mentioned that social media is a home for me, and yes, it's a stinky dumpster fire of a home. I still hang around there because of the friends and acquaintances I made over there. I have a modest following of 77,000 followers on Twitter, 50,000 on Blue Sky, and 90,000 on Instagram. I don't like the term influencer and do not think of myself as one. Let's start with that, okay? But I am aware that my posts have a wide reach. Of course, numbers are relative when there are other disabled folks with hundreds of thousands of followers. The numbers don't matter to me. Engagement, meaningful, authentic engagement, is what keeps me on those dumpster fires. So what do I do with this potential? As a disabled community organizer, I try to find things that I can do, sometimes in partnership with others, and things that I want to do that addresses a need. When the wildfires broke out in Los Angeles a few weeks ago, it became very clear that the city, state, and federal government was not rapidly responding to needs on the ground. Even though disabled people have been advocating for mask wearing in public since the beginning of the pandemic, and hey, we're still in a pandemic, a rapidly spreading wildfire with smoke clogging the skies is a public health hazard. On Twitter, I learned that mutual aid groups, often made up by disabled and queer volunteers, have been distributing masks as fast as possible. There were other posts of people donating pallets of masks and others raising money. So I wondered what I could do from San Francisco that was practical for me. So I decided to post on each of my accounts an offer for a signed copy of my latest anthology, Disability Intimacy, for every $100 donation to Mask Block LA, a mutual aid group that distributes masks for anyone in need. And guess what? After a few posts, I raised over $5,000. Many organizations have been saying money is the most useful thing people can donate, and in my small way I was able to raise a few $1,000s while giving people something unique. That is one example why community is impactful for advocacy work, because without the people who shared my post and or donated to the mask block, I wouldn't have been able to raise that money. It was an all-out community effort that was manageable for me, and I am so thankful and proud of the communities I belong to in these online trash heaps, also known as social media.
Your example about how you helped raise $5,000 for masks shows the real power of community in action. And you've highlighted something vital. Authentic engagement matters way more than numbers. This connects to my next question. Many of our audience members are digital accessibility advocates trying to be good allies with the disability community. What are some ways to be an ally?
To be honest, I am very wary of non-disabled people who ask how they can advocate for disabled people, when the question we should be asking is how non-disabled people can advocate with disabled people. And a lot of people assume they are the same, and or being an ally only means advocating for someone or some group. The difference between for and with is significant. For much of contemporary history, space has been taken up by family caregivers, professionals, and non-disabled advocates on disability issues such as digital accessibility, when disabled people are the ones who should be centered, the ones leading and the ones who are listened to, even if they don't have the professional experience or know the technical jargon that comes with the field. And this is true for people who have intellectual, developmental, or communication disabilities. I give a lot of side eye when people proclaim to be a voice for the voiceless. No, everyone has a voice, and our ideas of what constitutes a voice is clearly biased and neurotypical. Our society places a lot of value in normative ways of thinking, being, and communicating, and those who fall outside of those modes are seen as less than or incapable. The challenge for non-disabled allies is to undo the beliefs you have about disability and to reorient yourself in a way where you are considered a comrade, someone who is willing to do the work and to offer resources, privileges, and skills in a way that actually provides what the disabled person wants and needs rather than your assumptions of what they need. And on the specific issue of digital accessibility, listening to disabled people and what they prioritize about accessibility should shape the products you create. And disabled people's feedback should also inform not just the product, but everything that surrounds it, such as the marketing and testing. On a related note, I have issues whenever I see a company that has simulation exercises with the purpose of giving the digital accessibility professional an experience that purports to elicit empathy. It might sound like I'm being picky, but language matters. Words like empathy and awareness bother me when it's used in relation to disabled people. When you need to learn how to empathize with a minority group, the supposition is that they are so foreign, so different from you, a presumptive non-disabled person. The need to empathize with a disabled person means to me that we aren't quite human, and you have to go through a simulation sometimes with an assistive aid to show what it's supposedly like to have that disability and how a device or product can improve that person's life. However, you are only gaining brief experience of a disability and a demonstration of an assistive tech. What you're learning is based on a deficit model, where the person can't do something because of their disability, and then an assistive tech of some sort ameliorates the situation. Many simulation exercises offer a very narrow notion of access. Empathy is very icky to me. It's paternalistic, and these exercises don't produce a sense of empathy. At best, it's a superficial understanding from a brief simulation of what it's like to be disabled. And there have been studies and essays on why simulation exercises are harmful. I understand the need for experiential activities, but instead of simulation exercises, what if there were demonstrations of assistive technology by actual disabled people as the main event, with a discussion and additional resources for attendees? Wouldn't it be more interesting to go to a Q&A and hear a disabled person's critique of the tech and their recommendations of how it can be improved? Wouldn't that give more food for thought for the participants than simulation exercises? So much of allyship is performative, and I don't even use the term ally very often because it rings hollow. People want to help with the best intentions, but rarely are they open to becoming uncomfortable or questioning their motivations for wanting to be an ally. To me, it starts with that. Asking yourself some hard questions, and acknowledging what you do and do not know, and acknowledging how ableism, just like white supremacy, undergirds our society. I am so sick of non-disabled people who fall all over themselves wanting to help me without considering whether I want their help or not, or what terms under which I want that help. This might not be the pleasant answer you're looking for, but I am keeping it 100% real with you all today. Being an ally or comrade isn't conditional. There shouldn't be an expectation of gratitude. I'd like to think an ally or comrade is someone humble and there for you when it isn't convenient or easy. Solidarity is having someone's back even if it comes at a cost. It shouldn't be when it's for praise or self-promotion, and if I sound cynical, it's because I see a lot of so-called allies get off on being some sort of saint when disabled people just want to be taken seriously as a peer. I'm not sure if you are familiar with the term inspiration porn, but I would look it up, because it speaks to the media's representation of disability, where the disabled person is an object of pity combined with inspiration that seeks to educate and give teachable moments to non-disabled people. It's a feel-good story that centers the desires and expectations of the non-disabled audience. For example, every prom season there will be a human interest story of a disabled person going on a date. Going on a date is not newsworthy, but somehow it becomes one because the non-disabled person taking them is seen as some sort of angelic savior. That's not my idea of an ally. In short, presume competence. That is, believe that the disabled person has competence, and understand their needs and desires may fall outside of your imagination. From what I understand, the term presumed competence was coined in 1984 by Anne Donnellan, a researcher in special education. The term has been used originally with people who have intellectual and developmental disabilities or communication disabilities. Basically, the principle of presumed competence is that in the absence of evidence to the contrary, presumed competence rather than incompetence of the disabled person. It means everyone can learn and everyone has something to say. Also, one can be competent and still have access needs that are not mutually exclusive. Listening to the person, respecting them, and being open should be the default for anyone interested in being an ally/comrade.
Your call for authentic partnership and presuming competence is crucial guidance for us all. Before we close, I'd like to learn more about what energizes you. What are things that are currently bringing you joy? What are you most excited about in the future?
We live in such bleak times, and what keeps me going is living life to the maximum without apology. Despite the pain and challenges I experience daily, I am radically committed to a life of pleasure and joy. I love to cook and feed people. It is my love language, and I make lunch for my elderly parents about twice a week, so they don't have to cook as much. I love to entertain and enjoy hosting dinner parties, often co-hosting with friends for Friendsgiving, Hanukkah, and Lunar New Year. I love seeing my plants grow. I love caring for my cats, a bonded pair named Bert and Ernie that I adopted a little over a year ago. Being a cat parent has made me a more sensitive person for the better. And I love amplifying the work of disabled writers and artists who I admire greatly. Being able to use my privilege to pass on opportunities to other disabled people and support projects I believe in brings me so much joy. Right now I am starting work on my next anthology, Disability Vulnerability, and this will be a collection of essays by disabled people about how systems, institutions, and policies make their lives vulnerable. I am really excited to start work on this third anthology of mine that will become a trilogy. Thank you for having me today.
Alice, thank you for sharing your profound insights with us today. Your perspective on accessibility as an act of love rather than a burden. Your call for meaningful collaboration that works with rather than for the disability community, and your emphasis on the importance of addressing systemic ableism have given us all much to reflect on. As we close, I want to thank you for guiding us to think deeply about digital accessibility, not only as a technical requirement, but as part of a broader movement towards justice and collective liberation. And to our audience, thank you for joining us. Let's all take Alice's messages forward as we continue our work in digital accessibility, centering the disabled voices, questioning our own assumptions, and working towards disability justice and access for all. Remember, you're not alone. There is power in community. Thank you again, Alice, for your time, your wisdom today, and for the work you've done and continue to do to advance this mission. Now, y'all go and enjoy more of AxCon.